Hello, everyone, and I hope you are having a peaceful evening. Tonight, I am going to share some true, unsettling stories from chaotic periods of war. I hope to provide you with some quiet moments, maybe some moments of reflection, before you drift off to sleep. I appreciate you joining me. Let's not wait any longer. I will begin the first story now. Thank you for listening. This story begins on a Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. It was paradise. The sun rose over Oahu just before 7 a.m. It painted the mountains gold behind a place called Pearl Harbor. Along Ford Island, 7 battleships from the United States Pacific Fleet rested in neat pairs. Their crews were mostly asleep. Many were sleeping off their Saturday night shore leave. These were symbols of power. The USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS California. Each one represented over 35,000 tons of American steel. They were the reason the Pacific had been kept at peace for 2 decades. They sat there, quiet in the early morning light. The harbor was calm. The water was still. Most of the men aboard these ships were young. They were thinking about breakfast. They were thinking about home. They had no idea that their world was about to end. They had no idea that their names would become part of history, etched into memorials. They were just sailors, sleeping in their racks on a peaceful Sunday. But this peace was an illusion. It was a thin veneer covering years of simmering tension. America and Japan had been on a collision course for a decade. It started not with ships, but with resources. Japan's empire was expanding. It had moved into Manchuria. It had carved deep into China. But Japan had a fundamental problem. The empire possessed almost no natural resources of its own. No oil, no rubber, no tin. 80% of Japan's oil, the fuel for its war machine, came from only one place: the United States. In 1940, President Roosevelt tried to stop the expansion. He moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. It was meant as a deterrent, a warning, a dagger pointed at Japan's throat. Then, in July 1941, Roosevelt took the final step. He froze all Japanese assets. He enacted a total oil embargo. In one stroke, Japan lost access to 88% of its imported oil. Tokyo's leadership saw only 2 paths: retreat from a decade of conquest or secure resources by force. They chose war. But that fleet, that dagger at Pearl Harbor, had to be removed first. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was given the task. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew America's industrial strength intimately. He reportedly told his colleagues he could run wild for 6 months, or perhaps a year. But after that, he had utterly no confidence. He knew what this attack would unleash. He knew it was a desperate gamble. But the plan moved forward. For nearly a year, his pilots trained. They practiced in Kagoshima Bay, a stand-in for Pearl Harbor's geography. They rehearsed low-altitude torpedo runs again and again. On November 26th, 6 carriers departed Japanese waters in total radio silence. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. They sailed a northern route through rough seas, avoiding merchant lanes. On December 6th, they reached their launch point, roughly 230 nautical miles north of Oahu. Final reconnaissance confirmed the fleet was in harbor. The crews on the battleships in Pearl Harbor slept. They did not know that 350 miles to the north, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers had already turned into the wind. At 6 a.m. local time, the first wave launched. 49 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, 40 high-level bombers, and 43 fighters. They climbed through the dawn, formed up, and set their course for Oahu. The sun was just beginning to touch the mountains. The sailors were just beginning to wake. They were completely unaware that death was approaching from the sky, and that is where we must pause. Just as that first wave, 183 aircraft, began its inland approach over the water. The harbor was still asleep, but in minutes it would become a graveyard. We will continue this story right here and next time. If you would like to hear what happened, thank you for listening. The first wave of 183 aircraft flew for less than 2 hours. They climbed through the dawn, formed up, and set their course. Leading them was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. He was an experienced pilot, and this was the culmination of Admiral Yamamoto's year-long obsessive plan. As they approached Oahu, the skies were clear. There were no American patrol planes. There was no radio chatter indicating an alarm. Fuchida looked down at the harbor. It was exactly as the intelligence photos had shown. The battleships were lined up in neat pairs, sleeping in the morning sun. It was perfect. Too perfect. He almost couldn't believe it. This was the most powerful naval base in the world, and it was completely unaware. At exactly 7:48 a.m., the attack began. The first explosions were not at the harbor. They struck the airfields at Wheeler Field and Ford Island almost simultaneously. This was a critical part of the plan. The 43 fighters in Fuchida's wave were not there to fight other planes. They were there to destroy the American aircraft on the ground before they could ever take off. They swept in low, their guns blazing, tearing through the neat rows of P-40 and P-36 fighters. The American planes exploded, one after another, never leaving the tarmac. This ensured the Japanese bombers would have a clear run. With the airfields burning, the bombers began their work. There were different types, each with a specific deadly purpose. 51 dive bombers peeled off, screaming down from the sky. Their targets were the hangars, the machine shops, and the barracks. They wanted to create chaos and cripple the base's ability to respond or repair. Then came the 40 high-level bombers. They flew in steady formations, methodical, like a training exercise. Their job was to drop the heavy armor-piercing projectiles. These were modified battleship shells, designed to plunge through the thick deck armor of the battleships and detonate deep inside. But the most devastating of all were the 49 torpedo bombers. They came in low, dangerously low, skimming the surface of the harbor at just 60 feet. The pilots were the best in the Japanese Navy. They had practiced this shallow water drop for months. In Kagoshima Bay, American intelligence believed torpedoes were useless in Pearl Harbor. The water was too shallow. They were wrong. The Japanese had fitted their torpedoes with special wooden fins to keep them from diving into the mud. These planes were flying directly toward Battleship Row. 3 minutes into the assault, at 7:51 a.m., Commander Fuchida looked down at the chaos. He saw the smoke rising from the airfields. He saw the first torpedo wakes streaking toward the hulls of the battleships. He knew. He keyed his radio and sent the signal. The 3 words that would echo through history. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. It was not a battle cry. It was a message, a cold, precise confirmation for Admiral Yamamoto, waiting hundreds of miles away. The code meant complete surprise had been achieved. On the decks of the American ships, those 3 words meant nothing. The sailors were in a state of profound shock. Just moments before, they were preparing for church or waiting in line for breakfast. Now the world was ending. Alarms were ringing, but it was too late. Men ran to anti-aircraft guns that were still locked in boxes. Ammunition was stored below decks. Many officers were still ashore. The scene was one of total confusion. Men looked up and saw the red circles on the wings of the attacking planes. They couldn't process it. This was not a drill. The air was filled with the scream of dying planes and the thunder of explosions. The smell of cordite and burning fuel choked the air. Fuchida circled above the attack, his role now to observe and report. He watched as his pilots performed with lethal precision. He saw the torpedoes find their marks. He saw the flashes of the bombs hitting the decks. It was a textbook operation, a plan executed to perfection. The surprise was so total that for the first few minutes, the resistance was almost zero. The American giant was not just sleeping. It had been tied down in its sleep. The Japanese pilots felt a sense of exhilaration, of victory. They were striking a blow against a superior power. They were fulfilling their duty to their emperor. On the ground, there was only terror. Sailors were trapped, trying to escape their flooding compartments. Men were blown off decks and into the oily, burning water. The harbor, once a symbol of American strength, was instantly transformed into a scrapyard. The code, Tora, 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 was the sound of the trap snapping shut. It was the confirmation that the gamble had worked. The code meant complete surprise had been achieved. Then the harbor erupted. The code Tora, Tora, Tora was still echoing in Commander Fuchida's ears when his torpedo pilots began their final runs. They were flying at just 60 feet, threading their specialized weapons between the massive anchored ships. Their primary targets were the outboard vessels, the ones most exposed. Their first target was the USS Oklahoma. The Oklahoma was moored alongside the USS Maryland, leaving her entire port side vulnerable. The Japanese pilots did not miss. Within the first few minutes of the attack, the Oklahoma was struck, not by one torpedo, not by two. She absorbed as many as 9 torpedoes, one after another, ripping massive holes in her hull below the waterline. For the men deep inside the ship, the world simply ended. They were sailors just jolted from their sleep, running to battle stations in the dark. They felt the first impact as a dull, heavy thud. Then another, and another. The lights went out. The ship began to list slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. Men were thrown from ladders. Heavy equipment broke free, crushing anyone in its path. Water, black and oily, began to pour in. The ship was groaning. It was the sound of 35,000 tons of steel dying. On the deck, it was chaos. Men scrambled across the hull as the great ship began to roll, like a whale turning in the sea. They were trying to find purchase on the metal skin, which was now tilting toward the sky. Many just slipped and fell into the burning water. But the true horror was inside. The Oklahoma rolled completely over, her masts digging into the mud of the harbor bottom. She capsized. 432 sailors were trapped inside as she settled upside down. They were trapped in total darkness, in compartments filling with water, in air pockets that were quickly turning foul. For days after the attack, rescuers would hear it. A faint, desperate tapping from within the overturned hull. Men still alive, trapped in a steel coffin. They would try to cut through, but the task was almost impossible. Most of the 432 men would not be rescued. They would slowly suffocate or drown, just yards away from the surface. Nearby, the USS West Virginia was experiencing its own nightmare. She absorbed 7 torpedo hits. But her crew, demonstrating incredible training, managed to counter-flood the opposite compartments. They intentionally flooded parts of their own ship to keep her from rolling over. She sank, but she sank upright, her crew fighting until the end. The California, the Nevada, the Tennessee, each was taking hit after hit. Battleship Row was no longer a symbol of power. It was a shooting gallery. It was a slaughterhouse. Then, at 10 minutes past 8 a.m., the focus of the attack shifted. It was not a torpedo bomber this time. It was a high-level bomber, flying calmly through the smoke. This bomber carried a single special piece of ordnance, an 1,800-pound armor-piercing shell, a projectile modified from a battleship's own gun. It was designed to punch through the thickest armor. The bomber's target was the USS Arizona. The bomb was released. It fell for 6 seconds, a whistling sound that cut through the roar of the battle. It struck the Arizona near its forward turrets. It penetrated the deck. It plunged deep into the ship, finally coming to rest in the forward magazine. This was where the Arizona kept hundreds of thousands of pounds of gunpowder for her main guns. The resulting explosion was not a normal explosion. It was an event. The blast was so powerful it lifted the entire 35,000-ton ship out of the water. A fireball erupted, rising 500 feet into the morning sky, consuming everything in its path. The Arizona was gone. She was obliterated from the inside out. The forward part of the ship simply vanished. The shockwave was felt for miles. Men on other ships were knocked flat. The Arizona sank in 9 minutes. For most of the men on board, there was no warning. There was no time to fight. There was no time to skate. They were simply gone. Vaporized. Instantly erased from existence. The ship became their tomb. 1,177 men died with the Arizona. Nearly half of all Americans killed that morning. Just before 10 a.m., the second wave of Japanese aircraft turned and flew north. Silence began to settle back over Pearl Harbor. But it was not the peaceful silence of the morning. It was a heavy, deafening silence, broken only by the sound of fires, the hiss of steam, and the cries of wounded men. The attack, which had felt like an eternity, was over in less than 2 hours. For the survivors, the men who had lived through the fire and the explosions, this was the moment the shock truly set in. They stood on the decks of damaged ships or waded through oily water to the shore and looked at the devastation. It was a scene from a nightmare. The sky was black. A thick plume of smoke, mostly from the burning Arizona and the California, rose thousands of feet into the air, blocking out the morning sun. The harbor itself was on fire. Millions of gallons of fuel oil had spilled from the ruptured battleships, spreading across the water in a thick black carpet that was now burning. The water itself was a lethal inferno. Men who had been blown overboard were forced to swim through this, inhaling toxic smoke, their skin searing. Rescue efforts began immediately, but they were chaotic. Small boats zipped between the wrecks, pulling men from the water. Many were covered in thick black oil, unrecognizable. They were choking, blinded, badly burned. Medics on shore were overwhelmed. The main hospital was full within minutes. Temporary aid stations were set up on lawns under trees, anywhere they could lay a man down. The primary injuries were burns, horrific burns, and the psychological trauma was visible on every face. Sailors sat on the grass, rocking back and forth, staring blankly at the harbor. They were quiet. They were stunned. They were the living, surrounded by the remains of their friends. The scale of the destruction was almost impossible to process. The USS Arizona was gone, her wreckage still glowing hot, a tomb for over 1,000 men. The USS Oklahoma lay upside down in the mud, a massive sealant tomb for over 400. The West Virginia was sunk. The California was sunk. The Nevada had tried to make a run for the sea, but was beached, burning fiercely. In total, 5 battleships, the pride of the Pacific Fleet, were resting on the harbor bottom. 3 more were heavily damaged. Ashore, the airfields were junk. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed on the ground, lined up perfectly for the Japanese fighters. The attackers had barely been challenged in the air. The cost in human life was staggering. When the final counts were done, 2,403 Americans were dead. Thousands more were wounded. It was a catastrophic failure, a total, complete, devastating defeat. The Japanese losses, by comparison, seemed impossibly small. They had lost just 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 men, They had achieved one of the most decisive victories in the history of naval warfare. As the smoke cleared, the question began to form in the minds of the American commanders. How did this happen? How could they have been caught so completely unprepared? The anger was already beginning to build, replacing the shock. But in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto was not celebrating. He had received Fukida's report. He knew the tactical victory was overwhelming. But he also knew about the one critical failure of the mission. His plan had relied on destroying America's offensive capability. And that capability was not in the battleships. It was in the aircraft carriers. That Sunday morning, the three most important targets were not in Pearl Harbor. The USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga were all at sea, delivering aircraft to Midway and Wake Island. They were safe, untouched. Yamamoto's primary targets had escaped. He knew that those three ships, which he had failed to destroy, would soon be hunting him. The giant was awake, and it was furious. The news from Pearl Harbor traveled across the ocean in fragmented, frantic, coded messages. In Washington, D.C., where it was already afternoon, the first reports were met with stunned disbelief. An attack on Pearl Harbor? It seemed impossible. The naval base was a fortress, thousands of miles from any conceivable enemy. But as the hours ticked by, and the messages became more desperate, the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. The next day, on December 8, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt was helped to the podium of the United States Congress. He looked out at the assembled members, but his words were for the entire nation. A nation that was, in that moment, wounded, grieving, and suddenly, violently unified. The great debate was over. The years of isolationism, of believing the wars in Europe and Asia were someone else's problem, had ended at 7:48 a.m. the previous morning. Roosevelt's voice was grim, steady, and filled with a cold, controlled fury. He did not shout. He did not need to. His words were a hammer blow, each one landing with deliberate weight. Yesterday, he began, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He laid out the facts. The attack was unprovoked. It was premeditated. He spoke of the severe damage to American forces and the very many American lives that had been lost. He highlighted the deception, noting that just an hour after Japanese planes were bombing Oahu, the Japanese ambassador was delivering a reply to an American message, a reply that seemed to continue diplomatic negotiations. Roosevelt called it what it was: a lie. His speech was short, barely over 6 minutes. But it was everything the American people needed to hear. It channeled their profound shock and their deep grief into a single focused point of absolute resolve. He asked Congress to declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Empire of Japan. Within an hour, Congress voted. The declaration of war passed almost unanimously. America, the sleeping giant, was now fully, terribly awake. 3 days later, Japan's ally, Nazi Germany, declared war on America. The Second World War had become truly, inescapably global. But why? Why had Japan taken this monumental, almost suicidal gamble? The road to Pearl Harbor began not in 1941, but a decade earlier in the frozen fields of Manchuria. Japan's military leadership was building an empire. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a pleasant name for a brutal conquest. Japan had invaded China in 1937, but the war became a grinding stalemate that consumed resources at an alarming rate. And Japan had a fundamental problem. The empire possessed almost no natural resources of its own. No oil, no rubber, no tin. Roughly 80% of Japan's oil, the lifeblood of its planes and ships, came from one place, the United States. President Roosevelt had watched Japan's brutal atrocities in China with growing alarm. He responded not with military materiel, but with economic pressure. In July 1940, he restricted sales of aviation fuel and scrap metal. Then, in July 1941, after Japanese forces occupied southern Indochina, Roosevelt delivered the final blow. He froze all Japanese assets. Britain and the Dutch immediately followed. In one stroke, Japan lost 88% of its imported oil. Japan's war machine was strangling. The leadership in Tokyo now had only two options: retreat from China and abandon a decade of conquest, or secure resources by force. They chose war. Their new targets lay to the south, the rich oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber of British Malaya. But the American fleet at Pearl Harbor stood in the way. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the attack, called it a dagger pointed at Japan's throat. The dagger had to be removed. The plan was born of desperation. Destroy the Pacific Fleet in a single, devastating blow. This would buy Japan 6 months, time to conquer Southeast Asia and build a fortified perimeter. Then they hoped a war-weary America would be forced to negotiate a settlement. It was a fatal miscalculation. Yamamoto knew it. He had studied at Harvard and toured factories in Detroit. He understood American industrial capacity and resolve. He reportedly said, "I can run wild for 6 months, but after that, I have utterly no confidence." He knew he had not won a war. He had merely awakened something he could never defeat. But while America reeled from the shock, Japan's real plan was just beginning. Pearl Harbor was only a distraction. While America was still counting its dead in Hawaii, the full scope of Admiral Yamamoto's strategy was unfolding. Pearl Harbor was not the objective. It was a diversion. It was a devastating opening move, designed to cripple the U.S. Navy while Japan's real offensive began. And it began almost immediately. Within hours of the first bombs hitting the Arizona, Japanese forces were moving all across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. This was not a series of attacks. It was one single, coordinated offensive of stunning scope and terrifying speed. The sun never set on the Japanese attacks that day. They struck American airfields in the Philippines. They invaded Thailand and British Malaya. They landed troops in Hong Kong. This was the true plan. Seize the resource-rich territories of Asia before the Western powers, reeling from the shock, could ever respond. The primary target was the Philippines. It was American territory, and it was General Douglas MacArthur's command. MacArthur had received early reports of the Pearl Harbor attack, hours before the Japanese struck his own bases. But there was confusion. There were command delays. The air forces, his most powerful defensive tool, were not put on high alert. Many were still parked, wingtip to wingtip on the tarmac. At Clark Field and Iwo Field, Japanese bombers appeared in the Skeet bullseye, finding a scene almost identical to the one at Pearl Harbor. They found the American Far East Air Force sitting defenseless on the ground. The bombers and their fighter escorts swept in. They destroyed a large portion of MacArthur's air power, including many of his heavy B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters, before they ever got a chance to fight. It was a catastrophic, paralyzing blow. With air cover gone, the landings began 2 days later. Japanese troops hit the beaches at Luzon. MacArthur commanded roughly 100,000 Filipino soldiers and 20,000 American troops. But they were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and now they had no protection from the sky. While MacArthur's forces were being hit, the situation in British Malaya was becoming a nightmare. Japanese troops landed and pushed south through jungle that British commanders had considered impenetrable. The Japanese proved them catastrophically wrong. Japanese soldiers advanced on bicycles, moving faster through the dense jungle trails than the British forces could retreat. They outflanked every defensive position. Then, on December 10th, Japanese aircraft found two British capital ships off the Malayan coast, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. These were modern battleships. It was the first time in history that capital ships maneuvering in open water were sunk entirely by aircraft. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the carrier had truly arrived. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Wake Island, defended by a small marine garrison, held out heroically until December 23rd before being overwhelmed. The Japanese advance was a buzzsaw. It was relentless. Back in the Philippines, the situation was hopeless. The main Japanese invasion forces landed, and MacArthur's plan to defend the beaches, a plan that relied on air power that no longer existed, collapsed within days. His troops were being rolled back. Manila, the capital, was indefensible. By late December, MacArthur declared it an open city, meaning it would not be defended, to spare it from destruction. He had only one option left, one last desperate defensive line. He ordered his starving, outnumbered, and shell-shocked forces to withdraw. They were to pull back from the beaches, abandon the cities, and retreat into the mountains and jungles of a small, rugged peninsula west of Manila Bay. It was a place that would become infamous, a place of last stands, of starvation, and of unbelievable suffering. MacArthur's plan to defend the beaches collapsed within days. He withdrew his forces to a rugged jungle stronghold, Bataan. The retreat to Bataan was a desperate, chaotic move. But for the 120,000 American and Filipino soldiers, it was also a moment of grim resolve. They had been beaten on the beaches, their air cover had vanished. But this peninsula, this was different. Bataan was a fortress of jungle and mountains. It was a place they could defend. They dug in, establishing a line across the rugged terrain, and waited for the Japanese assault. They also waited for something else. They waited for help. They had been promised that a massive convoy, the largest in history, was already sailing from the United States to rescue them. They listened to radio broadcasts from home that spoke of a nation mobilized for war, of factories churning out equipment, of an angry America coming to save its sons. They believed it. They had to. It was the only hope they had. But it was a lie. In Washington, D.C., the maps told a different story. The Germany First strategy had been decided. The primary threat was seen as Hitler. All significant material, all the ships, all the tanks, and all the men were being prioritized for the European theater. The Philippines, on the other side of the world, were now a lost cause. They were to be sacrificed. The men on Bataan were on their own. They just didn't know it yet. In early January, the Japanese attacks began. The soldiers, American and Filipino, fought side by side with incredible courage. They bloodied the Japanese advance. They held their lines. But the Japanese soldiers were not their worst enemy. The real enemy was inside their own perimeter. It was starvation. The peninsula was not a supply depot. It was a jungle. The 120,000 men had enough food to last perhaps 30 days. The rations were cut almost immediately. First, they were cut in half. Then they were cut to 1/4. By late January, the men defending the lines were subsisting on less than 1,000 calories per day. They were starving while performing heavy manual labor and enduring combat. Hunger became an obsession. It drove men to eat anything that moved. The army's cavalry horses were the first to go. Then the pack mules. When they were gone, men hunted in the jungle. They ate monkeys. They ate lizards. They trapped rats. They ate snakes. They learned from their Filipino comrades which jungle roots were edible, which leaves wouldn't make them sick. They would boil bark just to have something warm in their stomachs. Men began to waste away. Their uniforms, already ragged from the jungle, hung on them like shrouds. They lost 30, then 40, then 50 pounds. They became walking skeletons, ghosts in a foxy foxhole. And with the starvation came the disease. The jungle, hot and wet, was a perfect breeding ground for sickness. Malaria was everywhere. The men would be fighting 1 minute, and the next they would be shaking with a violent fever, their bodies on fire in the 100-degree heat. The supplies of quinine, the only effective treatment, were exhausted in weeks. Then came dysentery. The water was contaminated. The sanitation was non-existent. The sickness was explosive, debilitating. It turned men into walking skeletons, too weak to even lift their rifles, too weak to walk. They died in their own filth. Dengue fever, carried by the same mosquitoes, added to the misery. The field hospitals were scenes from a medieval nightmare. They were just tents, pitched in the mud, with thousands of sick and wounded men lying side by side. There were no antibiotics. There were no painkillers. Bandages were soaked in biological trace, washed in contaminated rivers, and then reused. Surgical instruments were just boiled in pots of water. Men's wounds, even minor ones, became infected. The jungle rot ate away their flesh, exposing the bone. The smell was unbearable. It was the smell of sickness, of infection, and of death. Through all of this, the men still listened to the radio. They still heard the promises of help. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. It bred a dark, cynical humor. They began to call themselves the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. They were the forgotten. By March, the lines were breaking. Not because of Japanese attacks, but because the soldiers holding them were simply too weak to fight. They were starving, sick, and dying. They had held out for 3 months, a feat the Japanese thought was impossible. But they could not hold any longer. In Washington, President Roosevelt knew the end was near. The island was lost. He could not save the army, but he could save the commander. The general was too valuable, too symbolic, to risk capture. On March 11, 1942, a coded message reached General MacArthur's headquarters on the island of Corregidor. It was not an order for a counterattack. It was not a promise of reinforcement. It was an order from the President of the United States. He was to evacuate and leave his men behind. The order to evacuate was a devastating psychological blow, not just for the men on Bataan, but for General Douglas MacArthur himself. He was on the fortress island of Corregidor, in the mouth of Manila Bay, watching his army disintegrate just a few miles away. He argued. He protested. He wanted to stay and die with his men. But President Roosevelt was adamant. MacArthur was not a general anymore. He was a symbol, and that symbol could not be allowed to fall. On the night of March 11, 1942, MacArthur, his family, and his key staff made their escape. They boarded 4 small, fast PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, for a desperate run through the Japanese naval blockade. They sped through hundreds of miles of open ocean, hunted by Japanese destroyers and aircraft. It was a harrowing, near-miraculous journey in the darkness. They finally reached the southern Philippines, where a B-17 bomber was waiting to fly them the rest of the way. When he finally landed in Australia, the world's media was waiting. They wanted to know what had happened. They wanted to know what he would do. MacArthur, always aware of his place in history, stepped up to the microphones. He knew his men were still trapped. He knew they were starving and dying. He knew he had left them. He needed to give them something to hold on to. He needed to give the world a rallying cry. He spoke the words that would define the entire Pacific War. He did not say, "We shall return." He said, "I shall return." It was pure MacArthur, grandiose, theatrical, and deeply personal. For the Filipino people, it was a sacred promise. For the American public, it was a sign of unbreakable will. It was the defiant roar of a general who had been defeated but not broken. But for the men still trapped on Bataan, the words rang hollow. Their general was safe. He was in Australia, preparing for a war that would take years. They were still in the jungle, their stomachs empty, their bodies racked with fever, their ammunition gone. MacArthur had left General Jonathan Wainwright in command. It was a death sentence, a command with no hope. Wainwright held on for as long as he could. But the situation was impossible. The Japanese had launched their final offensive. The starving, skeletal defenders of Bataan, many too sick to even lift their rifles, finally collapsed. The lines broke. There was nowhere left to run. On April 9th, 1942, General Wainwright made the agonizing decision. To fight on would not be a battle. It would be a mass execution. He sent a signal. He was surrendering. It was the largest surrender in American military history. 76,000 men, Filipino and American, who had fought for 3 months, who had endured starvation and disease, who had believed help was coming, were now ordered to lay down their related equipment. They were now prisoners of war. They walked out of the jungle, hands raised, many holding their heads high. They were the battling bastards of Bataan, and they had done the impossible. They believed the fight was over. They believed the worst had passed. They were wrong. But for the 76,000 men who surrendered, their war was not over. A 65-mile journey into hell was about to begin. The 76,000 men who walked out of the Bataan jungle were not a defeated army. They were survivors. They had endured 3 months of hell. They were skeletons, ravaged by malaria, dysentery, and profound starvation. But they were alive. And as they laid down their military materiel, there was a sense of profound relief. The fighting was over. The hunger was over. The sickness could finally be treated. They were prisoners, yes, but they had survived. They believed the worst was behind them. They could not have been more wrong. The Japanese forces were completely unprepared for the sheer number of prisoners. They had expected a few thousand. They got 76,000. They did not have the food, the water, or the transportation to move such a massive group of men. And more importantly, they did not have the inclination. To the Japanese military command, surrender was the ultimate dishonor. A soldier who surrendered was lower than dirt. He deserved no respect, no dignity, and no mercy, and they would show none. The prisoners were ordered to march. Their destination was a prison camp, Camp O'Donnell, over 65 miles away. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Bataan Death March. The march began immediately in the brutal tropical heat of the Philippine sun. The men were already at the absolute limit of human endurance. They had not eaten a real meal in months. Many were already suffering from high fevers. They had open, untreated wounds. They had no water. The Japanese guards herded them onto the roads in long, shuffling columns. The first rule of the march was established quickly. You do not stop. You do not fall. You do not slow down. The men who collapsed from heat exhaustion or from the agonizing cramps of dysentery were not helped. They were not left behind to be picked up later. The moment a man stumbled and fell, a guard would move in. The other prisoners would hear a sound, a heavy thud, or the sharp report of a ballistic injury. The man would not get up. The column would be forced to march on, sometimes directly past the remains of their friend. Water became the only thing anyone could think about. The heat was oppressive, shimmering off the dusty roads. Men's throats swelled. Their tongues felt like wood. But there was no water given. The true agonizing cruelty of the march was that there was water everywhere. They marched past roadside pumps. They crossed clear, flowing rivers. They saw villagers trying to offer them food or small containers of water. But if any prisoner broke rank, if they made a move toward the water, they were killed on the spot. Guards would prevent the villagers from helping, sometimes attacking them as well. Men became delirious with thirst. They would see the water just yards away and know that trying to reach it meant certain death. It was a psychological torment as much as a physical one. The guards seemed to enjoy the spectacle. They would beat men randomly, striking them with rifle butts for no reason. They used their sharp implements, inflicting injuries on men who were barely standing. This was not a march. It was a procession of prolonged coercion. One of the most feared tactics was the sun treatment. The guards would halt the NT column in an open, unshaded field at midday. They would force the prisoners to sit, packed together, under the direct, blistering sun, for hours. No water, no movement. Men would go insane. They would bake to death on the hot ground. Those who tried to stand were immediately struck down. Each day, the column grew thinner. The sides of the road became a gruesome gallery of the fallen. The remains were left where they lay, a warning to the others. Keep walking. The men who survived did so by abandoning parts of their humanity. They watched their friends die and did nothing. They couldn't. They formed small groups, holding each other up, literally carrying their comrades to keep them from falling. But this, too, was dangerous. If a group slowed the column, the guards might turn on all of them. Estimates vary widely, but it is believed that during that 65-mile journey, between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipino soldiers died. Alongside them, roughly 500 to 650 Americans perished. They died of disease, of starvation, of heat stroke, and from direct, brutal violence. It was a crime of war, committed out of contempt and cruelty. The men who finally staggered into Camp O'Donnell were no longer men. They were ghosts. They were specters who had walked through the apocalypse. Thousands died. But even this was not the end. The surrender of Bataan had not ended the fight. On the fortress island of Corregidor, General Wainwright and a few thousand men still held out. For almost another month, they endured constant aerial saturation. But on May 8th, the last fortress, Corregidor, finally fell. The Philippines were lost. By the spring of 1942, Japan's military leadership in Tokyo looked at the maps of the Pacific, and they could not believe their own success. The gamble, the desperate strike at Pearl Harbor, had worked better than they had ever imagined. In just 5 months, they had achieved every single one of their strategic objectives. The rising sun flew over a new empire of staggering size. The fall of the Philippines was just one piece of this grand, terrifying offensive. On February 15, 1942, the impossible happened. The city of Singapore surrendered. This was not just another island. This was the Gibraltar of the East. It was the supposedly impregnable fortress of the British Empire in Asia. British commanders had planned for a seaborne invasion, but the Japanese had attacked from the land, through jungle the British believed was impassable. The fortress fell in just 70 days. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered 85,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops to a Japanese force of just 36,000. Winston Churchill would later call it the worst disaster in British military history. The conquerors were brutal. In Singapore, Japanese troops carried out a large-scale attack on ethnic Chinese civilians, targeting anyone suspected of anti-Japanese sentiments. But for the Japanese High Command, this was simply securing their flank. Their main objective, the reason for the entire war, lay to the south, the Dutch East Indies. These islands held one of the world's richest oil fields, the prize that had driven the entire strategy from the beginning. Borneo fell in January, Sumatra in February, Java in March. The oil Japan so desperately needed, the oil that America had cut off, was now flowing to the empire. By May 1942, Japan's empire had reached its maximum extent. It was one of the largest in human history, containing roughly 400 million people. It stretched from the borders of India, south to the approaches of Australia, and east into the mid-Pacific. They controlled the oil of the Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the rice fields of Burma and Indochina. The greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was now a reality. For the American public, this was the absolute lowest point of the war. Pearl Harbor had been a shock. The fall of Bataan was a humiliation. But this string of unstoppable Japanese victories was terrifying. It seemed Japan could not be beaten. Morale in the United States was completely shattered. The news was a daily drumbeat of defeat. The Japanese soldier seemed like a Superman, a fanatic who could march for days on no food and defeat armies 3 times his size. The Japanese Empire looked invincible. But in that rapid, stunning success, the seeds of disaster were already planted. The empire was vast, but it was dangerously overextended. Supply lines stretched for thousands of miles across hostile waters. Occupation troops were spread thin across territories where the local populations harbored deep, simmering resentment. And most critically, Japan lacked the industrial capacity to defend what it had conquered. The empire had won its gamble on speed and surprise, but now it faced an opponent with 10 times its industrial capacity. An opponent who was, at that very moment, mobilizing for total war. In America, the shock of Pearl Harbor and the humiliation of the Philippines had transformed the nation. Isolationism had vanished overnight. Factories were converting to war production. Millions of men were volunteering for service. But that was all in the future. In the spring of 1942, Japan seemed invincible. American morale was shattered. President Roosevelt knew he needed a victory. He needed something, anything, to prove that Japan itself was vulnerable. He needed to strike back, even if it was a suicide mission. The Japanese Empire seemed invincible. American morale was at its lowest point since the war began. President Roosevelt understood the psychology of his people. He knew America needed a victory. It did not have to be a big victory, but it had to be a loud one. It had to prove that Japan itself was not a sacred, untouchable place. It had to prove that they could be hit. The problem was distance. Japan was 5,000 miles from the American West Coast. No land-based bomber had the range to fly there and return. The Navy's aircraft carriers could get close, but their planes, the carrier-based aircraft, were too small. They could not carry a meaningful bomb load that far inland. The problem seemed impossible. Then someone in the Navy, a captain named Francis Lowe, had an audacious idea. What if Army bombers, the big ones, could take off from a Navy aircraft carrier? It had never been done before. An Army B-25 Mitchell bomber was a 30,000-pound machine. It needed a long runway. An aircraft carrier's flight deck was barely 500 feet long. But in February 1942, they ran a test. They proved it could work. Barely. With modifications, stripping the planes of weight and packing them with extra fuel, a B-25 could stagger into the air from a carrier deck. But there was a catch. A very big catch. Landing back on the carrier was impossible. There was no way to do it. This would be a one-way mission. The bombers would have to take off, fly to Japan, drop their bombs, and then just keep flying. They would have to fly it over Japan and try to reach airfields in China. They would have to hope to find friendly territory before their fuel ran out. The man chosen to lead this desperate, almost suicidal mission was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was 45 years old. He was a legend in aviation circles. He was not just a pilot. He held a doctorate in aeronautics from Midway. He was an air racing champion. He was a pioneer of instrument flying. If anyone on Earth could pull this off, it was Doolittle. He called for volunteers. He told his men he could not reveal the mission's objective. He could only tell them it was extremely hazardous. Every man in his unit stepped forward. Doolittle selected 80 men, 16 five-man crews. They began intensive secret training at Eglin Field in Florida. They practiced short takeoffs again and again, painting a line on a runway to simulate the carrier's short deck. They all knew this was a one-way mission. On April 2nd, 1942, the USS Hornet departed San Francisco Bay. Lashed to her flight deck were 16 B-25 bombers. It was a sight that made no sense to any sailor who saw it. The Hornet's own planes were stored below, just to make room. The plan was to sail within 400 miles of Japan on April 18th, launch the bombers, and then runway. But on the morning of April 18th, the task force was still far out, roughly 650 nautical miles from Tokyo. That was when they spotted it. A Japanese picket boat, the Nitomaru. The American ships immediately opened fire and sank it. But it was too late. The Nitomaru had already transmitted a radio warning. The element of surprise was gone. Admiral Bull Halsey, commander of the task force, and Colonel Doolittle made a split-second decision. They had to launch. Immediately. This was the moment. They were 250 miles farther out than they had planned. The extra distance meant that reaching the Chinese airfields was no longer a possibility. They would run out of fuel. The crews knew it. They would have to crash land or bail out over China and hope for the best. At 8:20 a.m., the Hornet turned into the wind. The sea was rough. Waves crashed over the bow. Doolittle's bomber was first. He revved his engines, the plane straining at its brakes. He released. The B-25 thundered down the pitching deck. At the last possible moment, Doolittle pulled back. The bombers staggered into the air with barely 20 feet to CC. One by one, the other 15 bombers followed. In a minor miracle, all 16 made it safely airborne. 7 hours later, flying at treetop level, they approached the Japanese coast. Air raid sirens did not sound. People on the streets of Tokyo looked up, confused. Some even waved, thinking they were Japanese planes. Then the bombs began falling. The damage was minimal. This was a pinprick, not a knockout blow. But the psychological impact was devastating. For the first time since the 13th century, foreign-related equipment had struck the Japanese home islands. The sacred realm was vulnerable. The emperor's military had failed to protect him. The Doolittle raid had struck Tokyo. The physical damage was almost nothing. But the psychological damage to the Japanese high command was total. Admiral Yamamoto was humiliated. The American carriers, which he had failed to destroy at Pearl Harbor, had now proven they could strike the sacred homeland itself. His obsession grew. He had to find and destroy America's remaining carriers. He had a complex plan to do it, a plan to lure them into a decisive battle. But before he could launch his master trap, another major Japanese offensive was already in motion. In May of 1942, while Doolittle's raiders were still trying to find their way home from China, American codebreakers intercepted disturbing communications. A new Japanese offensive was forming. The targets were Port Moresby in New Guinea and the small island of Tulagi in the Solomons. If Japan secured these positions, they would control the approaches to Australia. They would sever the lifeline between America and its only remaining major ally in the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the new commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, had to stop them. He scraped together everything he had. He coordinated multiple task forces, sending them to a remote, vast stretch of water northeast of Australia. The force included Task Force 17, centered on the carrier USS Yorktown, and the force built around the USS Lexington. They were sailing to a place called the Coral Sea. What followed in those warm May waters would change the very nature of war at sea. On May 7th, American scout planes spotted the Japanese ships. The carriers Lexington and Yorktown turned into the wind and launched their aircraft. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters. They climbed into the sky and went hunting. At the exact same moment, the Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zukaku, were doing the same thing. They were launching their own strikes. The opposing squadrons, hundreds of planes in total, actually passed each other in the ski race. On the scene, each fleet was hunting the other. But the fleets themselves were separated by over 200 miles of open ocean. This was the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle in all of human history where the opposing ships never came within visual range of each other. The ships never exchanged a single shot. The entire battle was fought by the pilots, high in the air, or in terrifying low-level torpedo runs. It was a new, strange, and impersonal kind of warfare. The American dive bombers found the Japanese light carrier Shoho, which was escorting the invasion convoys. They swarmed the small carrier. Multiple bombs and torpedoes struck home. The Shoho sank in minutes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading the strike, radioed back the exuberant, now famous message, "Scratch one flat top." But the Japanese pilots found the American oiler, Neosho, and the destroyer Sims. They mistook them for a carrier and a cruiser and sank them both. The main American carriers remained hidden for now. May 8th brought the main engagement. At dawn, both fleets launched their full strikes almost simultaneously. Again, the opposing squadrons crossed paths, each racing to destroy the other's carriers first. Japanese aircraft found the Yorktown and the Lexington. The Yorktown took a single heavy bomb hit, but her crew contained the damage. She remained operational. But the Lexington, the Lady Lex, was hit badly. She absorbed 2 torpedo hits and several bombs. At first, she seemed to survive. Her damage control teams were excellent. They contained the fires. They counter-flooded to correct her list. It looked like she would make it. Meanwhile, American aircraft found the Japanese carrier, Shokaku. They hit her with 3 bombs, tearing her flight deck apart. She was heavily damaged but remained afloat. Both sides, bloodied and exhausted, began to withdraw. Then, disaster struck the Lexington. Hours after the battle had ended, deep within the ship, gasoline vapors from her ruptured fuel lines finally found a spark. A massive internal explosion ripped through the carrier. Then another. The fires became uncontrollable, raging deep in her hull, where firefighters could not reach. By late afternoon, Lady Lex was a lost cause. The captain gave the order to abandon ship. The crew, orderly even in this final moment, slid down ropes into the warm, oily water. To prevent her capture, an American destroyer was forced to torpedo its own carrier. The USS Lexington sank into the Coral Sea. The battle ended as a tactical draw. America had lost a fleet carrier. Japan had lost a light carrier. But strategically, it was a stunning American victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled. Australia remained secure. And critically, both of the Japanese fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were now out of action. They were either too damaged or had lost too many aircraft to be part of Japan's next, even bigger operation. And that operation was exactly what Yamamoto had been obsessed with. The Doolittle raid had given him the political power to force his plan through. He was ready to set his ultimate trap. Admiral Yamamoto was humiliated. The Doolittle raid had proven his failure to destroy the American carriers at Pearl Harbor. The inconclusive Battle of the Coral Sea, while stopping the Port Moresby invasion, had only increased his obsession. He was convinced that Japan's empire was not safe until America's remaining carriers were found and destroyed. He would force a final decisive battle. He conceived an elaborate, massive, and incredibly complex plan. It involved multiple task forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands in the north, hoping to draw the American fleet away. Then his main carrier strike force, 4 fleet carriers, Aki, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike a tiny speck of coral in the Pacific. It was a place called Midway Atoll. Midway was just 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It housed an American airbases. Yamamoto knew the Americans would have to defend it. When the American carriers, hopefully drawn from the north, rushed to save Midway, his fleet would ambush and annihilate them. It was a brilliant plan. It was intricate. It was methodical. And it had one single fatal flaw. The Americans were reading Japan's mail. Deep in the basement of a building at Pearl Harbor, in a secure facility nicknamed the Dungeon, a team of American cryptanalysts was working 24 hours a day. They were led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was not a typical naval officer. He was eccentric, often working in a bathrobe and slippers, but he was a genius. His team, Station Hypo, had been working tirelessly to break the Japanese naval code, a complex system called JN-2050. By early 1942, they were not reading everything, but they were reading enough. They began intercepting fragmented messages about a massive new operation. The messages spoke of a diversion in the north, of a huge carrier force, and of a main objective designated only by 2 letters, AF. But where was AF? The intelligence officers in Washington insisted it must be Hawaii, or maybe even the West Coast. But Rochefort, studying the patterns, felt a cold certainty. He believed AF was Midway, but he had to prove it. He couldn't just guess. The lives of the entire Pacific Fleet depended on him being right. So Rochefort devised a clever, simple test. It was a bluff. He contacted the American base on Midway using a secure underwater cable. He instructed them to send an unencrypted plain language radio message, a message they knew the Japanese would intercept. The message was to report that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Days later, the trap sprung. The code breakers at Station Hypo intercepted a new coded Japanese message. The message stated that AF is short of water. Rochefort had it. He had his proof. He immediately informed Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz now knew Yamamoto's target. He knew his timing. And based on the intercepts, he knew his strength. It was a terrifying picture. The Japanese were coming with 4 fleet carriers. Nimitz had only 3. And one of them, the USS Yorktown, was currently limping back from the Battle of the Coral Sea, heavily damaged. But Nimitz, a calm, decisive commander, saw the opportunity. Yamamoto's complex plan was his weakness. The Japanese believed they were setting a trap. They had no idea that the Americans knew they were coming. Nimitz ordered the carriers Enterprise and Hornet to sail immediately from Pearl Harbor. And he gave an impossible order for the Yorktown. She needed months of repair. The shipyard at Pearl Harbor was told they had 3 days. Workers swarmed the Yorktown. They patched her hull. They reinforced her decks. They worked around the clock in a frantic race against time. On May 30th, just 3 days after arriving, the Yorktown, still trailing an oil slick, still crawling with repair crews, steamed out of Pearl Harbor to join the fleet. By June 2nd, both American task forces were in position. They were hidden, 200 miles northeast of Midway, lying in wait beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance. Admiral Yamamoto had no idea they were there. The trap was set. But this time, it was an American trap. The American trap was set. But a trap is only as good as its execution. 200 miles away from the Japanese fleet, the American carriers Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown had launched everything they had. 151 aircraft were now racing toward an enemy they had never seen. But the strike was a mess. It was uncoordinated, flying in radio silence to avoid detection. The different squadrons could not communicate. They became separated in the vast empty sky. Some squadrons navigated poorly and flew off into the wrong sector of the ocean, missing the Japanese fleet entirely. The first to find the enemy were the torpedo bombers. These were men flying the Douglas Devastator, a plane that was already tragically obsolete. It was slow, under-armored, and carried a Mark 13 torpedo that often malfunctioned. Around 9:20 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet found the Japanese carriers. 15 aircraft. They were flying low and slow, just 50 feet above the water, exactly as their training dictated. But their fighter escort, the planes meant to protect them, had gotten lost. They were alone. Below them was the most powerful carrier fleet on Earth. Above them, the sky was black with Japanese Zero fighters. The Zeros fell on them like wolves. The Devastators were not planes. They were targets. One by one, they were shot down easily. Burning aircraft tumbled into the sea. The pilots and gunners had no chance. They did not turn back. They did not scatter. They pressed the attack, flying straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarming fighters. Of the 15 planes, 14 were destroyed. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, who would float in the water, wounded, and watch the rest of the battle unfought. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise attacked next. 10 aircraft, 10 shot down. No survivors. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown followed. 12 aircraft, 10 shot down. In less than 20 minutes, the American torpedo force was annihilated. It was a catastrophic failure. 41 torpedo bombers had attacked. 35 of them were destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit its target. On the bridge of the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched the slaughter. His victory seemed total. His carriers were untouched. His fighters were the best in the world. He had just made a fateful decision. His first strike on Midway had not been enough, and he had ordered his reserve planes rearmed for a second land attack. Then, his scout planes had spotted the American carriers. His decks were in chaos, with crews trying to swap bombs back to torpedoes. But the American attack had been crushed. He was faith. But the sacrifice of those torpedo pilots, those dozens of men who had just died for nothing, had accomplished something critical. Something nobody could have planned. They had drawn every single Japanese fighter, every Zero protecting the fleet, down to wavetop level. The sky directly above the Japanese carriers was now completely, utterly empty. High above, at 14,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was leading 33 dive bombers from the Enterprise. He was lost. His fuel was running dangerously low. He was about to turn back. Then, he spotted a tiny white wake on the blue ocean below. It was a single Japanese destroyer, racing north. McCluskey made a decision. He would follow it. He followed that ship, hoping it would lead him to the fleet. And then, around 10:22 a.m., he looked down through a gap in the clouds. He saw it. Not one carrier, but 3. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu. They were spread out below him, magnificent and completely vulnerable. Their decks were crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. Fuel lines snaked across the steel. Bombs and torpedoes sat exposed, waiting to be loaded. Every Japanese fighter was thousands of feet below, still chasing the ghosts of the torpedo planes. McCluskey pushed his own plane over into a steep, screaming dive. 32 other aircraft followed him down. The next 5 minutes would change the world. It was 10:22 in the morning. The 33 dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, led by Wade McCluskey, were screaming down from 14,000 feet. At the exact same moment, dive bombers from the USS Yorktown were arriving over the Japanese carrier Soryu. The ski above the Japanese fleet, which had been empty just seconds before, was now filled with American planes. On the decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, it was the moment of maximum vulnerability. The planes were armed, the fuel lines were running, the torpedoes and bombs were exposed. The Japanese crews looked up, their faces frozen in disbelief. These were not the slow, low torpedo planes they had just slaughtered. These were coming almost straight down. The first bomb struck the Kaga. 4 direct hits. 1,000-pound bombs tore through her flight deck and detonated in the hangar below, where aircraft were being prepared. The explosion was catastrophic. It ignited the fuel. It detonated the exposed torpedoes. The Kaga erupted in a series of secondary explosions that tore the massive ship apart. Hundreds of men died in the first seconds. The Soryu was next. The Yorktown's bombers hit her with 3 bombs in rapid succession. All 3 struck among the aircraft being prepared for launch. The carrier, like her sister, became a single blazing wreck. Admiral Nagumo was on the bridge of his flagship, the Akagi. He watched in stunned, paralyzed silence as Kaga and Soryu were transformed into infernos. Then, his own ship was struck. The first bomb hit near the center elevator. It penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, precisely where his torpedo planes were being armed. The blast ignited the fuel. The torpedoes detonated. Within seconds, the Akagi, the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack, was a roaring inferno. It had taken 5 minutes. 5 minutes. In the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were mortally wounded. They were burning from bow to stern, dying where they floated. The tide of the Pacific War had not just turned, it had reversed itself in a violent, 5-minute cataclysm. Admiral Nagumo stood on his dying bridge, unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster. He had won a total victory, and 5 minutes later, he had lost everything. But one Japanese carrier remained, the Hiryu. Operating separately from the other 3, she had escaped the American dive bombers. Even as her sister ships burned, the Hiryu's commander launched a desperate, furious counterattack. Her planes found the USS Yorktown. 3 bombs struck home, and the Yorktown lay dead in the water. A few hours later, a second strike from Hiryu hit the Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. The carrier began to list dangerously. The order was given to abandon ship. It seemed the Hiryu might yet salvage some small victory from the disaster. But her triumph was short-lived. American scout planes found her. Around 5 p.m., 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, many of them the same pilots from the morning attack, found the last Japanese carrier. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu. Like her sisters, she erupted in flames. By nightfall on June 4th, all 4 of the Japanese fleet carriers, the pride of their navy, the ships that had struck Pearl Harbor, were burning or sinking. Admiral Yamamoto, hundreds of miles away, on his super battleship, received the catastrophic news. His complex plan had collapsed. His carriers were gone. The Battle of Midway was over. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of its best, most irreplaceable pilots, and thousands of veteran sailors. America had lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown. Japan had lost the strategic initiative. No longer could it expand. No longer could it dictate the war's tempo. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. Now, it was America's turn to attack. Japan's offensive power was broken. Their four best carriers were at the bottom of the Pacific. The irreplaceable pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor were gone, lost in the skies over Midway. The tide had turned. Now, it was America's turn to attack. The question was, where? General MacArthur in Australia wanted to drive through New Guinea and back to the Philippines. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, wanted to secure the supply line to Australia by attacking the Solomon Islands. The debate was settled by a reconnaissance flight in July 1942. The flight discovered something alarming. On a remote, jungle-covered island in the southern Solomons, the Japanese were building an airfield. The island was called Guadalcanal. From that airfield, Japanese bombers could strike Allied shipping lanes. They could cut off Australia. They could threaten New Zealand. That airfield could not be allowed to be completed. The order came down from Admiral Nimitz. The 1st Marine Division would seize Guadalcanal and the nearby island of Tulagi. The operation was codenamed Watchtower. The Marines, however, had another name for it. They called it Operation Shoestring. It was a name born of cynical gallows humor. The planning was inadequate. The supplies were insufficient. The intelligence was almost non-existent. Most of the 19,000 Marines assigned to the invasion were teenagers who had never seen combat. They had trained in New Zealand for barely a month. Their maps were drawn from outdated charts and blurry aerial photos. Nobody knew how many Japanese troops were on the island or where they were. It was a plan held together by hope and blind courage. The assault was scheduled for August 7th, 1942, 8 months to the day after Pearl Harbor. At dawn, the invasion fleet appeared off the coast. Cruisers and destroyers opened fire, pounding the northern beach with high explosive shells. The bombardment lasted for nearly 2 hours. At 9:10 a.m., the first wave of Marines hit the beach, which they had designated Red Beach. They were braced for the hell of a contested landing. They expected machine guns, mortars, and artillery. They expected the nightmare of 1,000 Japanese soldiers dug in and waiting. They found an empty beach. There was no one there. The landing was completely unopposed. The Japanese construction workers and their small military guard, about 2,300 men in total, had been taken by complete surprise. They had simply dropped their tools, left their meals half-eaten, and fled into the dense jungle and mountains of the interior. The Marines waded ashore, almost in disbelief. It felt wrong. It was too easy. They advanced cautiously through the coconut groves, expecting an ambush at any moment. But the only enemy they found was the island itself. The heat was oppressive, reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was nearly 100%. Men carrying 70 pounds of equipment collapsed from heat exhaustion. The jungle was a solid wall of green. On August 8th, the Marines reached the airfield. It was almost complete. Another few weeks, and Japanese bombers would have been taking off from it. The Marines immediately renamed it Henderson Field, after a pilot killed at Midway. Engineers began working to finish the runway for American planes. The invasion seemed like a perfect success. They had seized their primary objective with almost no casualties. But the Japanese were not going to let this island go. And the Americans' easy victory was about to turn into a 6-month nightmare. But that night, offshore, a Japanese strike force approached in the darkness. The Marines, safe on the island, were about to become stranded. On the night of August 8, 1942, the 19,000 Marines on Guadalcanal were dug in around the newly captured airfield. They felt secure. The invasion had been almost bloodless. Offshore, the huge American invasion fleet remained. Cargo ships were still unloading the critical supplies, the food, the ammunition, the medical equipment. Protecting them was a screen of Allied cruisers and destroyers, commanded by Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. He had positioned his screening force in two main groups, guarding the two channels north and south of a small, silent volcanic cone called Savo Island. It seemed like an adequate defense. But the Americans were exhausted. Their crews were tired, and they were fatally overconfident. They did not expect what was coming through the darkness. 600 miles to the north, at the Japanese fortress of Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had assembled a strike force of 7 heavy cruisers and 1 destroyer. His mission was simple: race south under cover of night, destroy the American transports, and leave the Marines on Guadalcanal to die. Mikawa's force raced south at high speed, undetected. This was the kind of battle the Japanese Navy had trained for. They were masters of night combat. They had superior optical equipment, powerful binoculars, and night scopes that could pierce the darkness. They had perfected coordinated torpedo attacks in total blackness. The Americans, by contrast, had barely trained for night surface action. They were relying on primitive radar, a new technology its operators barely understood. Most critically, they did not believe the Japanese would dare to attack. At 1:30 a.m., on August 9th, Mikawa's lookouts spotted the Southern Allied force. The Japanese ships were in a single column, moving at 30 knots, and they were completely undetected. Mikawa launched his reconnaissance float planes, which dropped flares, suddenly illuminating the Allied ships against the dark water. On the bridge of the HMAS Canberra, Australian sailors saw the flares but did not recognize them as hostile. Minutes later, torpedoes slammed into the Canberra's side. Simultaneously, 8-inch shells tore through her superstructure. The cruiser was engulfed in flames within minutes, her captain killed instantly. The USS Chicago, next in line, took a torpedo that blew off part of her bow. Confused, her captain turned the ship away from the battle, thinking he was under submarine attack, and took no further part in the fight. The Japanese column, unscathed, raced past the dying Canberra and turned north, straight for the second group of American ships. Aboard the cruisers, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and USS Quincy, sailors were asleep at their stations. They saw the flares to the south, but no alarm was raised. At 1:44 a.m., the night exploded. Japanese searchlights blazed from the darkness, pinning all 3 American ships in their beams. Shells rained down before the American crews could even react. The Astoria took hits to her bridge, her fires erupting. The Quincy tried to turn, but Japanese shells found her bridge, killing her captain and most of the bridge crew instantly. Torpedoes hit her port side, and she began to list heavily, consumed by fire. The Vincennes was caught in a brutal crossfire. Mikawa had split his force, attacking her from both sides. Within minutes, the Vincennes was a burning wreck, her masts collapsing. The entire engagement lasted 32 minutes. By 2:16 a.m., Admiral Mikawa, his ships barely scratched, ordered his force to withdraw. As dawn broke over Guadalcanal, the Marines on the beach and the sailors on the transports looked out at the water in horror. The scale of the disaster was clear. The HMAS Canberra, abandoned and burning, was scuttled. The Quincy had sunk in just 20 minutes. The Vincennes sank at 5 a.m. The Astoria fought her fires until noon. Then she too capsized and sank. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were at the bottom of the sea. 1,077 Allied sailors were dead. It was the worst naval defeat in the history of the United States Navy. Admiral Mikawa's primary targets, the transports, were now completely undefended. He could have sailed in and destroyed them all, dooming the entire campaign. But he made a critical mistake. He feared that dawn would bring American carrier aircraft, not knowing that Admiral Fletcher's carriers had already withdrawn. Unwilling to risk his cruisers, Mikawa retreated north. It was a mistake that saved the Marines. But as the sun rose, the surviving transport ships, only partially unloaded, fled. The Marines on the beach watched them go. They watched as 4 of their own cruisers burned and sank in the water in front of them. Their naval protection was gone. Their supply line was cut. 19,000 men were stranded, with limited ammunition, inadequate food, and no certainty of resupply. The Marines were alone, stranded. They held Henderson Field, a strip of dirt and gravel carved from the jungle. But they held it with limited ammunition, almost no medical supplies, and food for only a few weeks. They controlled an airfield, but at first, they had no aircraft to fly from it. And they were not just fighting the Japanese. They were fighting the island itself. Guadalcanal was a hostile entity. The daytime temperatures reached 100 degrees, with humidity so thick it felt like you were breathing water. Sudden rainstorms turned the ground into a knee-deep swamp of vomit. And then there were the mosquitoes. They swarmed in black clouds, carrying malaria and dengue fever. Within weeks, nearly half the Marines would be sick. But the sickness would have to wait. The Japanese counterattack came first. Tokyo had dismissed the landing as a minor raid. Now they recognized its strategic importance. They sent their elite. On the night of August 18th, 900 soldiers of the Ichiki detachment landed east of the marine perimeter. Their commander, Colonel Kanao Ichiki, was a veteran of China. He held the American Marines in total contempt. He believed one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki ordered a frontal assault. His soldiers fixed bayonets and charged in a human wave, screaming war cries. They ran directly into the American machine gun positions across the Tenaru River. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Marines opened fire into the darkness. Tracer rounds lit up the night. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red, cutting down wave after wave of the attackers. The Japanese soldiers, driven by their code, would not stop. They climbed over the remains of their own comrades, only to be cut down themselves. When dawn broke, the scene was a nightmare. 777 Japanese bodies lay in front of the Marine lines. Colonel Ichiki, in his shame, burned his regimental colors and committed suicide. The ferocity shocked the Marines. These were not soldiers who would surrender. They would die to the last man. But the Japanese were not finished. They began a new kind of war, a war of attrition. Every single night, fast Japanese destroyers raced down from Rabaul. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. Under cover of darkness, these ships would land more troops, more supplies, and then race back north before dawn could bring American planes. The Marines called it the Rat Run. By mid-September, over 6,000 Japanese troops surrounded Henderson Field, and they brought artillery. Every night, Japanese guns shelled the airfield. Marines huddled in their foxholes as explosions tore through the runway and the surrounding coconut groves. Sleep became impossible. During the day, the bombers came. 27 Japanese bombers would appear at noon with such regularity that the Marines called it Tojo time. Air raid sirens wailed. Men dove into their dugouts and prayed. The airfield was under attack 24 hours a day. And the sickness was winning. Malaria infected nearly every man on the island. The fever came in cycles. Men would shake with uncontrollable chills in the 100-degree heat, then burn with fevers reaching 105. Dysentery followed. Men lost control of their bodies. They became dehydrated, gaunt, skeletal. Some lost 50 pounds in a month. Food ran short. Supply ships could not get through. The Marines were reduced to 2 meals a day, then 1. They survived on captured Japanese rice, which they called Guadalcanal stew. Akira brought the crisis. The Japanese landed over 20,000 troops for one final massive assault. The attack began on the night of October 23rd. For 3 days and nights, Japanese forces attacked the marine perimeter in wave after wave. The focus of the fighting was a ridge south of the airfield. It became known as Bloody Ridge. Japanese soldiers attacked uphill, climbing over their own dead, directly into machine gun fire and artillery. When ammunition ran low, Marines fought hand-to-hand with knives and entrenching tools. Men grappled in muddy foxholes. The ridge became a slaughterhouse. By October 26th, the Japanese attack collapsed. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the slopes of the ridge. The Marines had held. But the fight for the island was far from over. It had also spread to the coldest place on Earth. While Marines were dying in the 100-degree heat of Guadalcanal, fighting for a muddy airfield, another war was unfolding thousands of miles to the north. It was taking place in one of the most hostile environments on the planet, the Aleutian Islands, a chain of black volcanic rock stretching from Alaska toward Russia. On June 7, 1942, just days after their defeat at Midway, Japanese forces had invaded. They had landed on the islands of Attu and Kiska. It was a small move, part of their diversion for the Midway operation. But it had a staggering psychological impact. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops were occupying American soil. The American public was outraged. Washington knew the islands were strategically irrelevant. They were too remote, too cold, too barren to threaten any foreign one. But they could not allow a Japanese flag to fly over American territory. The islands had to be retaken. In May of 1943, 11,000 American troops sailed to assault Attu. They expected a tough fight. They had no idea what they were getting into. The Japanese, about 2,500 elite troops, were not their primary enemy. The island itself was. The weather in the Aleutians is among the worst on Earth. It is a place of near constant thick fog, where visibility is measured in feet, not miles. The winds exceed 100 miles per hour. It is a place of freezing rain and snow, even in the middle of summer. The American troops were completely unprepared for this. Many of the soldiers were from California. They had never experienced cold weather combat. They landed in freezing temperatures and deep, sucking mud. Their weapons froze. The oil in their rifles turned to sludge. Their radios failed in the wet, penetrating cold. But the worst part was what the cold did to their bodies. It was not just the enemy fire that was killing them. It was frostbite. It was immersion foot or trench foot. Men's feet, constantly soaked in icy water and mud, began to rot inside their boots. The flesh would turn black, then die. More men were disabled by the weather than by Japanese bullets. The battle was supposed to take 3 days. It lasted for 19. The Japanese had fortified the high ground, digging into the frozen ridges. The Americans had to climb up and root them out, one by one, in a blinding fog. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, and miserable. American casualties mounted. The Japanese fought with their usual fanaticism, defending every ridge, every valley. But by May 29th, they were finished. They were out of ammunition. They were surrounded. Defeat was certain. And for the Japanese soldier, defeat was not an option. That morning, the 500 remaining Japanese soldiers gathered for one final attack. They were armed with whatever they had left. Bayonets, swords. Many were armed only with grenades. Then, on May 29th, the remaining Japanese soldiers launched one final, suicidal banzai charge. They charged through the fog, screaming, running directly at the American lines, many armed only with grenades they held against their stomachs. The banzai charge on Attu was a horrifying preview of the fanaticism that American forces would face as they pushed closer to Japan. The lesson was clear. Japanese soldiers would fight to annihilation rather than surrender. But back in the South Pacific, the grueling fight for Guadalcanal was finally over. By February 1943, Japan had evacuated its last starving, skeletal survivors. Henderson Field was secure. The supply line to Australia was free. The tide, which had turned at Midway, was now an undeterrable American advance. But for the American High Command, one man remained a symbol of Japan's military genius. He was a ghost they could not catch. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor. He was the mind behind Japan's early, shocking victories. As long as he was alive, Japan had a strategic mastermind, a man who understood America and was still capable of planning a devastating counterstroke. The Americans had been hunting him for months. And in April 1943, Japan's own arrogance delivered him. On April 13th, Station Hypo in Hawaii, the same code-breaking unit that had uncovered the Midway plan, intercepted another critical message. It was a detailed itinerary. Admiral Yamamoto's complete inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message contained everything: his departure time from Rabaul, his exact flight path, his arrival times, even the number of escort fighters. The intercept was immediately brought to Admiral Nimitz. But this was not a simple decision. If they attacked Yamamoto, if they succeeded, they would be revealing their most precious secret. They would be telling the Japanese, in no uncertain terms, that their naval codes were broken. Japan would change their codes, and the intelligence advantage that had won Midway would vanish. Nimitz consulted Washington. The decision went all the way to the top. President Roosevelt gave the simple two-word order: get Yamamoto. The mission was codenamed Operation Vengeance. The challenge was distance. Yamamoto would be flying near Bougainville, a flight of over 600 miles, round trip, from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. No American fighter had that range, except one. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. It was a unique twin-engine fighter, and with large external fuel tanks, it could just make the journey. 18 P-38s were selected for the mission. Their commander, Major John Mitchell, planned it with mathematical precision. They would fly in total radio silence. They would fly for over 400 miles at just 50 feet above the ocean, skimming the wavetops to avoid Japanese radar. They had to time their intercept to the exact minute. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raid, the P-38s took off from Henderson Field. For over 2 hours they flew in silence, navigating only by compass and watch, just feet above the water. At 9:33 a.m., they reached the skies over Bougainville. And then they saw them, exactly on schedule, exactly where the intercept said they would be. 2 Japanese Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The P-38s dropped their tanks and climbed to attack. A furious dogfight erupted. But 2 pilots, Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, broke through the escort and went for the bombers. Lanphier attacked the lead bomber, the one carrying Yamamoto. He raked it with machine gun fire. Smoke erupted from the bomber's right engine. The aircraft rolled left, trailing fire, and plunged straight down into the dense jungle below. Barber hit the second bomber, which crashed into the ocean. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. The P-38s turned and raced for home. The next day, Japanese search teams found the wreckage in the jungle. They found Admiral Yamamoto's remains, still strapped in his seat, thrown clear of the impact. His white-gloved hand was still gripping his katana. The architect of Pearl Harbor was gone. And America's industrial might, the tsunami that Yamamoto had always feared, was finally ready. The island-hopping campaign was about to begin, starting with a fortress called Tarawa. By November 1943, the island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific was beginning in earnest. The objective was Tarawa Atoll, specifically a tiny island on that atoll called Betio. It was barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, a sliver of coral and sand that barely rose above the ocean. But Betio had something Japan would die to protect: an airfield. From Tarawa, Japanese planes could strike American supply lines. Take Tarawa, and the path to the Marshall Islands and the Marianas would be open. And Japan knew this. For over a year, they had been turning Betio into a fortress. It was arguably the most heavily defended piece of land on the planet. The commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had 4,500 elite Japanese troops, special naval landing forces, dug in and waiting. The defenses were a nightmare. 500 pillbox istas, constructed from coconut logs and reinforced concrete. Bunkers with walls 5 feet thick. Anti-boat obstacles and wire extended for hundreds of yards offshore. Machine gun positions were set up, with interlocking fields of fire covering every inch of the beach. Admiral Shibasaki was so confident in these defenses that he made a boast to his men. He said, "1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. The Americans gave themselves 3 days. The assault began on November 20th. The pre-invasion bombardment was the heaviest yet seen in the Pacific. 3 battleships that had been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, the Maryland, the Colorado, and the Tennessee, opened fire. For nearly 3 hours, over 3,000 tons of shells hammered the tiny island. The Marines watching from their transport ships were certain nothing could survive. They believed they would be walking onto an island of dust and remains. They were wrong. The Japanese were deep underground, in reinforced concrete bunkers, waiting. Then came the critical, fatal mistake. American intelligence officers had studied the tide charts. They predicted 5 feet of water over the coral reef that surrounded the island. This would be enough for their landing craft to sail right up to the beach. But they were wrong. It was a neap tide, a monthly occurrence where the tidal range is minimal. Instead of 5 feet of water, there were 3. In many places, just 18 inches. The first wave of Marines approached in amphibious tractors, Amtrak, which were designed to crawl over the reef. And they did. They lumbered across the coral and delivered the first wave directly onto the beach, into a wall of fire. But then came the next waves. They were in standard landing craft, Higgins boats, loaded with hundreds of men. And at 9:10 a.m., those boats slammed to a halt. They were grounded on the reef. They were stuck. 400, 500. In some places, 700 yards from the shore. The Marines inside faced an impossible choice: stay in the boats and be destroyed by Japanese mortars, or go over the side. They went over the side. They plunged into waist-deep, sometimes chest-deep water, and began to wade. The Japanese gunners who had survived the bombardment emerged from their bunkers and opened fire. They had pre-sighted every inch of that reef. Water erupted around the Marines as bullets struck. Mortar shells fell among them. Men, weighed down with 70 pounds of equipment, struggled through the water. It was not a charge. It was a slow, agonizing walk into a meat grinder. Men stepped into unseen holes in the reef and, weighed down by their gear, simply vanished and drowned. Others were hit by machine gun fire and sank. Wounded men, unable to keep their heads above water, drowned where they fell. The lagoon, for 700 yards, turned red. The Marines who survived that 700-yard walk through the red water found no safety on the beach. There was no cover. The naval bombardment had flattened the palm trees, but it had done almost nothing to the reinforced Japanese bunkers. The survivors were pinned down, huddled behind a coconut log seawall that was barely 3 feet high. They were trapped. They were taking casualties from mortars and machine guns that had them in a perfect crossfire. By noon on that first day, the assault was teetering on the edge of total disaster. Bodies floated in the lagoon. Wounded men lay on the beach, unable to be evacuated, dying under the tropical sun. But the Marines were not broken. They began to advance, not as an army, but as small groups of 2 or 3 men. They began to crawl, yard by yard, from one shell hole to the next toward the bunkers. This was the beginning of the real battle for Tarawa. It was a battle fought at point-blank range. Each pillbox was a separate war. A Marine would crawl forward, under covering fire, until he was right up against the concrete firing slit. He would shove the muzzle of his rifle inside and empty it. Then another Marine would rush the entrance. But the Japanese were deep inside, in tunnels, waiting. The only way to clear them was with fire and explosives. Flamethrower teams became the most important men on the island. A man carrying a 70-pound tank of napalm on his back would have to crawl, exposed, toward a bunker. He would become the target for every Japanese gunner. His life expectancy was measured in minutes. But he would get there. He would spray a long stream of burning fuel into the firing slit, incinerating the defenders inside. Then, another Marine would run up and throw a satchel charge, a bag full of explosives, into the bunker's entrance to silence it for good. This was how they advanced. Bunker by bunker, yard by yard. By nightfall on the first day, 5,000 Marines were ashore, but they held a beachhead that was barely 300 yards deep. The Japanese counterattacked all night. The fighting was hand-to-hand in the darkness. For 2 more days, this brutal, intimate warfare continued. The island was a landscape of hell. The smell of death, of burning fuel, of decay, was overpowering. But by the 3rd day, American numbers and firepower finally began to tell. Sherman tanks, which had finally made it across the reef at high tide, provided mobile firepower, blasting bunkers at close range. On November 23rd, 76 hours after the first Marines hit the beach, the island was declared secure. The butcher's bill was devastating. Admiral Shibasaki's boast about 1 million men and 100 years had been proven wrong. But the cost was staggering. 1,009 Marines were killed. Over 2,000 more were wounded. In 3 days, for an island of 2 square miles, the Americans had suffered over 3,000 casualties. And what of the defenders? Of the 4,500 elite Japanese and Korean laborers on the island, only 17 were captured alive. The rest were dead. 4,490 bodies were counted. But the story of Tarawa did not end there. A Marine Corps combat cameraman, Lieutenant Lewis Haywood, had filmed the entire battle. His footage was not heroic. It was graphic. It was honest. It showed the full horror. It showed Marines being cut down on the reef. It showed the floating remains in the lagoon. It showed the terrible aftermath of close combat. Military commanders wanted to suppress the footage. They argued it was too graphic, too demoralizing for the American public. But President Roosevelt himself intervened. He insisted it be released. He believed the American public needed to understand the true cost of victory. In early 1944, that footage appeared in newsreels across America. The public was shocked, but it did not weaken their resolve. It strengthened it. War bond drives surged. Mothers and fathers who had lost their sons wanted their sacrifice to mean something. The military learned, too. Tarawa taught painful, agonizing lessons. Pre-invasion bombardment must be longer. Tidal calculations must be perfect. More amphibious tractors were needed. These lessons would save lives at the next islands. But those lessons were purchased with biological trace on a beach called Betio. Tarawa taught painful lessons. But as America prepared for the next leap, Japan's carrier force prepared for one last battle. The lessons from Tarawa, purchased with so much biological trace, were immediately put into action. The island-hopping campaign was now a relentless, methodical advance. The next major leap was Operation Forager. In June of 1944, the target was the Mariana Islands, and the most important of these islands was Saipan. Saipan was not just another piece of coral. It was the key to ending the war. It was a volcanic island, 14 miles long, and it sat just 1,250 miles from Tokyo. This was the magic number. It was within range of America's newest, most terrifying piece of military materiel, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. From airfields on Saipan, B-29s could fly to Japan, drop thousands of tons of bombs, and return. From Saipan, America could burn Japan's cities to ash. Japan understood this. Tokyo knew that if Saipan fell, the war was, for all practical purposes, over. Saipan would be defended to the death. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded 32,000 elite Japanese troops on the island. Unlike Tarawa, they did not defend the beaches. They were dug into the island's caves, its mountains, and its rugged high ground, waiting. On June 15th, the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific refit, 800 ships, 15 battleships, 21 aircraft carriers, 127,000 assault troops. The pre-invasion bombardment lasted for 13 days, pounding the island. Then the Marines landed. But as the Marines pushed inland into the fortified hills, the Japanese Navy made its last desperate gamble. They knew they had to stop this invasion. The entire remaining Japanese carrier force, which had been hiding and rebuilding, sailed to intercept the American fleet. This was the moment Japan had been waiting for. This would be the decisive carrier battle that Yamamoto had always dreamed of. But this was not 1941. This was 1944. The Japanese carriers were still formidable, but their pilots were not. The experienced elite aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor and fought at Midway were almost all gone. The new Japanese pilots were replacements, rushed through training with less than 100 hours of flight time. The American pilots, by contrast, were veterans. They were fighting superior planes like the new Hellcat fighter, and they had radar. On June 19th, the Japanese launched their strikes. Hundreds of aircraft took off from their carriers, flying toward the American fleet. The Americans detected them on radar at 70 miles out. They were not surprised. They were waiting. They sent their own fighters up to intercept. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. American pilots described it as an old-fashioned turkey shoot. The inexperienced Japanese pilots flew into a wall of American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. They were shot down in droves. One American pilot, Commander David McCampbell, shot down 7 Japanese planes himself in a single afternoon. The Japanese planes fell out of the sky in flames, one after another, littering the ocean. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been shot down. American losses were fewer than 30. It was the most lopsided aerial battle of the war. It became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier aviation, as a functional fighting force, ceased to exist that day. Japan's last trained carrier pilots were now at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. For the 32,000 Japanese soldiers on Saipan, this was the end. They heard the news. Their fleet was gone. There would be no rescue. There would be no resupply. They were trapped. On Saipan, General Saito knew defeat was inevitable. On July 660, he gathered his remaining officers. He prepared for the only thing he had left to give. He ordered one final suicidal banzai charge involving every able-bodied man. General Saito knew his fleet was gone. He knew his 32,000 men were doomed. Defeat was inevitable. On July 6, 1944, he gathered his officers for a final meal. He then gave his last order. It was not an order to surrender. It was an order for one final suicidal banzai charge. Every living, breathing, able-bodied man left was to participate. Soldiers, sailors, walking wounded, anyone who could hold a piece of military materiel. After giving the order, General Saito did not wait to see it carried out. He committed ritual suicide in his cave headquarters. Nearby, in another cave, was another, more famous Japanese commander, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. This was the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, the man who had lost 4 carriers at Midway. He had been trapped on Saipan, his command now meaningless. He, too, ended his own life. The charge they ordered, however, was just beginning. In the pre-dawn darkness, at 4:45 a.m., on July 7th, the American soldiers of the Army's 27th Infantry Division were dug in, waiting. They knew an attack was coming. They just had no concept of the scale. It started as a low sound, a rumble, then a roar. Out of the darkness, a human wave of over 3,000 Japanese soldiers began to charge the American lines. This was not a tactical maneuver. It was a suicidal wave of fanaticism. The men in the front were the soldiers, and they had rifles. But behind them were men with nothing. Some carried only bayonets lashed to long bamboo poles. Others, the walking wounded, limped forward, carrying only rocks or pieces of broken bottles. Their only goal was to die, and to take as many Americans with them as possible. The Americans opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. They poured everything they had into the charging mass. The Japanese fell in heaps, but they did not stop. They kept coming, climbing over the remains of their own men. The sheer numbers and the fanatical energy of the charge were overwhelming. The wave of 3,000 men hit the American lines and broke through. They overran the forward positions. The fighting became hand-to-hand. It was a chaotic, brutal melee in the darkness. Men were fighting with knives, with entrenching tools, with their bare hands. The Japanese, even those mortally wounded, would not stop. They would try to pull the pin on a grenade or inflict an injury with a sharp object with their last dying breath. The charge was unstoppable. The Japanese soldiers who broke through the line just kept running south. They ran, screaming, through aid stations, killing wounded soldiers and medics. They overran artillery positions. Some of them penetrated as far as 3 miles behind the American lines before they were finally hunted down and killed. The battle raged for hours. It was a scene of unbelievable carnage. By noon, the charge had finally collapsed. The ground for miles was littered with Japanese remains. Over 4,000 Japanese lay dead. The banzai charge was over. The military resistance on Saipan was broken. But the military horror was not the worst part of Saipan. As the Americans advanced north, into the last remaining Japanese-held territory, they encountered something else. They found thousands of civilians huddled on the island's northern cliffs. The military battle for Saipan was over. The banzai charge had failed. General Saito was gone. But the true lasting horror of the island was just beginning. As the American Marines and Army troops advanced into the northern part of Saipan, they were not just clearing out the last few soldiers. They were encountering the civilian population. Over 22,000 Japanese and Korean civilians lived on Saipan. And for 3 years, Japanese propaganda had been pounding a single, terrifying message into their minds. They were told that the Americans were not men. They were demons. They were barbarians. They were told that if captured, The American soldiers would inflict prolonged coercion. They would rape the women, and they would kill the children. The civilians believed this. They believed it with all their hearts. As the American lines advanced, thousands of these families, carrying their children and their elderly, fled. They ran until there was nowhere left to run. They found themselves pushed to the island's northernmost cliffs. Sheer drops, hundreds of feet straight down to the rocky coastline and the ocean below. What happened next would haunt the American soldiers for the rest of their lives. The Marines watched, helpless, as the civilians began to commit mass suicide. They were not just jumping. It was systematic. Japanese soldiers, still among them, would order them to jump. They would promise them a better place in the next life. But mostly, the families did it themselves. Mothers holding their infants would walk to the edge, bow, and then step off. Fathers would gather their small children, sometimes pushing them over the edge before jumping themselves. Elderly couples held hands and walked off together. The Americans watched this in profound, frowning horror. They got on loudspeakers. They had Japanese interpreters shout, begging them to stop. "Don't jump," they yelled. "We won't hurt you. We will give you food. We will give you water. Your children will be fine." Some listened. A few hundred, terrified, would slowly emerge from caves or come down from the cliffs and surrender. But most did not. The propaganda was too strong. They believed the Americans' kindness was a trick, a lie to make their eventual suffering worse. The Marines, battle-hardened men who had just fought through hell, broke down. They watched, weeping, as a mother held her baby's head under the water in the surf, drowning her, before a soldier could wade out and stop her. They saw men gather their families in cubbies and detonate grenades, killing everyone inside. The cliffs became known by two names, Suicide Cliff and Bonsai Cliff. This was not war. This was a mass, weaponized hysteria. The psychological impact on the American troops was indescribable. They were there to fight soldiers. Instead, they were forced to be spectators at the mass death of women, children, and the elderly. Innocents who had been convinced that surrender was a fate worse than death. The exact number will never be known, but estimates suggest that on Saipan, in addition to the 32,000 soldiers who did, over 10,000 civilians ended their own lives. Saipan was a strategic victory. The airfields were built. The B-29s would soon fly. But the victory was hollow, stained by this profound human tragedy. Saipan revealed a terrible truth. Japanese propaganda had successfully weaponized its own civilian population. If this was how civilians behaved on a small conquered island, what would happen on the Japanese home islands? The horror of Saipan was a dark prophecy. It had shown American planners what awaited them. A war not just against an army, but against a population that had been convinced to choose self-destruction over surrender. But before that final, terrible question of invading Japan could be answered, the promise had to be kept. 2.5 years after he had been evacuated by PT boat, leaving his starving army behind, General Douglas MacArthur was coming back. The promise he made in March 1942, "I shall return," had become his personal obsession. By October 1944, MacArthur commanded the largest amphibious force ever assembled in the Pacific Theater. 700 ships, 174,000 troops. The target was Leyte, an island in the central Philippines. Strategically, the Philippines were the key to strangling Japan. The oil from the Dutch East Indies, the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine, flowed through these waters. Recapture the Philippines, and Japan's fuel supply would be cut to zero. But for MacArthur, this was about honor. This was redemption. On October 20th, 1944, after a massive multi-day bombardment that had learned the lessons of Tarawa, The American troops hit the beaches. The landings, surprisingly, were almost anticlimactic. The Japanese had withdrawn inland, choosing to fight in the hills. That afternoon, MacArthur prepared for his moment. Photographers and correspondents were in place. At 2 p.m., MacArthur's landing craft approached the beach. It grounded in 3 feet of water. The ramp dropped. He stepped off into the surf, wearing his trademark crushed cap and aviator sunglasses, his uniform crisp. He waded ashore, his face a mask of determination, in an image that would be captured for history. On the beach, a microphone was waiting. MacArthur stood before it and spoke the words that echoed across the Pacific. "People of the Philippines," he said, "I have returned." It was pure theater. It was magnificent. And it was deeply sincere. But as MacArthur spoke, the Japanese Empire was preparing its final desperate gamble. Tokyo understood that losing the Philippines meant losing the war. Admiral Suwemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, ordered everything to converge on Leyte Gulf. The entire remaining Japanese Navy, every battleship, cruiser, and destroyer that could still sail, was thrown into one last apocalyptic battle. The plan was complex, audacious, and suicidal. Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, now largely empty of planes and pilots, would be used as bait. They would sail north of Leyte to lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, the main American carrier force, away from the invasion. Meanwhile, 2 massive battleship forces would race through the narrow straits of the Philippines from the west. They would time their arrival perfectly, enter Leyte Gulf from 2 directions, and annihilate the undefended American transports. It was a suicide mission designed to cripple MacArthur's army and buy Japan a few more months. What followed was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. It was 4 separate engagements, fought over 3 days. One part of the Japanese plan failed immediately. Their southern force, steaming into the Surigao Strait, was met by Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's line of American battleships. 5 of those battleships had been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor. This was their revenge. In the last battleship versus battleship action in history, the Japanese force was annihilated. But the other parts of the plan, they worked. Admiral Halsey saw the decoy carriers. He took the bait. Believing the main threat was to the north, he took his entire fleet of fast carriers and battleships and raced off in pursuit, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. At 6:37 a.m. on October 25th, the main Japanese force, 4 battleships including the super battleship Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers, emerged from that undefended strait. They turned south. Between them and MacArthur's defenseless transports, there was almost nothing. All that stood in their way was a tiny task force of 6 small, slow escort carriers. Jeep carriers. Their call sign was Taffy 3. They were protected by a handful of destroyers and even smaller destroyer escorts. These ships were not designed to fight battleships. They were designed to hunt submarines. It should have been a slaughter. But the Americans fought with a desperate courage that bordered on insanity. The escort carriers turned and ran, launching every plane they had, armed with whatever they carried. The destroyers did the impossible. They turned toward the Japanese fleet. The USS Johnston, commanded by Ernest Evans, charged directly at the Yamato, a 5,000-ton ship attacking a 60,000-ton behemoth. The Johnston fired its torpedoes and then engaged Japanese cruisers with its 5-inch guns. It was hit again and again, but kept fighting until it sank. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, a ship half the size of the Johnston, also charged, engaging a heavy cruiser. The sacrifice of these tin-can sailors confused Admiral Kurita. The smoke screens, the constant air attacks, the suicidal destroyer charges. He believed he was facing a much larger force. At 9:25 a.m., with the American transports visible on the horizon, Kurita made one of the most inexplicable decisions of the war. He ordered a general withdrawal. The landing beaches were saved. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. The Imperial Japanese Navy, as a fighting force, ceased to exist. But one island remained before Tokyo, a volcanic rock called Iwo Jima. The Imperial Japanese Navy was gone. It was at the bottom of Leyte Gulf, and the airfields on Saipan were now fully operational. By early 1945, the B-29 Superfortress bombers were flying daily missions from the Marianas to the Japanese homeland. But it was a long, dangerous 3,000-mile round trip. The crews were pushing their aircraft to the absolute limit. And when a bomber was damaged over Tokyo, when it took anti-aircraft fire, or was hit by a fighter, it faced a terrible choice. The pilots could not make it back to Saipan. They would have to ditch in the vast, cold, empty Pacific Ocean. The bomber would hit the water, break apart, and the crew, if they survived the impact, would be left floating. They would die of exposure, or they would drown, long before any rescue could arrive. Thousands of airmen were being lost this way. The American High Command needed a solution. They looked at the map. Halfway between the Marianas and Japan, there was an island, an emergency landing strip, a place for damaged bombers to land, and, just as importantly, a base where P-51 Mustang fighters could be stationed, fighters that could then escort the bombers all the way to Tokyo and back. The island was 760 miles south of Tokyo. It was called Iwo Jima. It was 8 square miles of volcanic ash, sulfur deposits, and black sand. At its southern tip was a 556-foot extinct volcano called Mount Suribachi. It was one of the ugliest, most desolate, most strategically critical pieces of real estate on the planet, and America needed it desperately. The Japanese understood its value just as well. They knew that if Iwo Jima fell, the American air offensive would become unstoppable, so they sent their best commander to defend it, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi was not like other Japanese commanders. He was brilliant, he was practical, and he knew America. He had served as a military attaché in Canada and the United States. He had traveled across the country. He understood American industrial might and the American psyche. He knew Japan was losing the war, but he also knew he could make America pay a price so terrible, so bloody, that they might just negotiate for peace rather than continue. He spent 9 months preparing Iwo Jima, and he threw out the entire Japanese defensive playbook. He rejected the traditional strategy of defending the beaches. He knew American naval firepower would obliterate any defense at the waterline. He called beach defense suicide. Instead, he would let the Americans land. He would let them crowd onto the beaches, and then he would annihilate them. Kuribayashi turned the entire island into a fortress. Not a fortress of surface bunkers, a fortress underground. His men dug over 11 miles of tunnels. These tunnels connected 1,500 bunkers, pillboxes, and hidden caves. Some of these positions were 5 levels deep, protected by dozens of feet of volcanic rock. His positions were all mutually supporting. An American attacking one bunker would be fired upon from 3 others. Every gun was hidden. Artillery pieces were in caves, behind steel doors that would roll open, fire, and then roll shut again. Kuribayashi's orders to his 21,000 defenders were simple, and they were chilling. There would be no banzai charges, no wasted lives in fanatical screaming attacks. They would fight from underground. They would be patient. They would be invisible. And every single man must kill 10 Americans before he himself died. For 3 days before the invasion, American ships and aircraft pounded Iwo Jima. It was the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War. The Marines had requested 10 full days of shelling. The Navy said 3 was all they could provide. At 9 a.m. on February 19, 1945, the first wave of 30,000 Marines hit the beaches. The first thing they realized was that the beach was not sand. It was black, volcanic ash. And it was soft. Vehicles immediately bogged down, their tracks spinning uselessly in the loose ash. Men struggled to walk. Every step they took, they sank ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep, weighed down by their equipment. And then, they realized the second, more terrifying problem. You could not dig a foxhole. The volcanic sand would not hold a shape. It just collapsed immediately. There was no cover. For the first few minutes, there was an eerie silence. Almost no resistance. The Marines began to push inland, struggling through the ash, believing the bombardment had worked. Then, Kuribayashi sprung his trap. From hidden positions in the terraces above the beach, from invisible caves in Mount Suribachi, from pillboxes that had survived the shelling completely intact, the island erupted in fire. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, and rifles all opened up at once. They had pre-sighted every inch of that beach. The Marines were packed together, thousands of them, completely exposed. They had nowhere to hide. They could not move forward. They could not dig in. The beach became a killing ground. It was a calculated industrial slaughter. By nightfall on that first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore, but 551 of them were dead. Nearly 2,000 were wounded, and the battle for Iwo Jima had just begun. The beach was a killing ground. The Marines were pinned down in the black volcanic ash, with no cover, taking horrific casualties. Their first objective was clear. It loomed over them, a silent, menacing shadow. Mount Suribachi. The extinct volcano dominated the southern end of the island, and it was a fortress. Japanese observers on its summit could see every inch of the landing beaches. They were calmly, methodically directing artillery and mortar fire onto the men below. That mountain had to be taken. For 3 days, Marines fought their way up its slopes. It was not a climb. It was an assault, clearing caves with flamethrowers and grenades, fighting hand-to-hand for every yard of volcanic rock. On the morning of the 4th day, February 23rd, a 40-man patrol from Easy Company finally fought its way to the summit. The top was quiet. They found a length of Japanese pipe. At 10:20 a.m., they attached a small American flag to it and raised it. Down below, the effect was electric. Men on the beaches, who had been huddled in the ash, stood up. They cheered. Ships offshore sounded their horns. For a single brief moment, the relentless battle paused. There was hope. But the flag was small, hard to see through the smoke. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, watching from a ship, wanted a larger one. He wanted a symbol that would last. A second patrol was sent up the mountain, carrying a much larger flag. Around noon, 6 men struggled to plant this new, heavy flag against the wind. 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman. An Associated Press photographer, Joe Rosenthal, was with them. He raised his camera, almost without aiming, and snapped a picture. He had no idea what he had just done. He had just captured the most reproduced, most iconic image of the entire war. It was a perfect moment of triumph. But it was a lie. The battle for Iwo Jima was not over. In fact, it had barely begun. That photograph, that symbol of victory, was taken on day 4 of a battle that would last for 36. Of the 6 men in that famous picture, 3 would never leave the island. Harlan Block would be killed by a mortar shell. Franklin Sousley would be killed by a sniper's ballistic injury. Michael Strank would be killed by a shell from an American destroyer. The 3 who survived, John Bradley, Rene Gagnon, and Ira Hayes, would be sent home as heroes to sell war bonds. Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian, would be haunted for the rest of his life by survivor's guilt, by the men who died while he became a celebrity. The flag was up, but the Marines still had to take the rest of the island. They had to advance north, into General Kuribayashi's main defenses, into the meat grinder. For 31 more days, the Marines fought for every yard of that volcanic rock. Kuribayashi's tunnel network was a masterpiece of death. Marines would capture a pillbox, only to have Japanese soldiers emerge from a hidden spider hole behind them and attack. The fighting was at point-blank range, often hand-to-hand in the dark, suffocating tunnels. Flamethrower teams were the only answer. A man carrying a 70-pound tank of napalm on his back would have to advance, exposed, toward a cave entrance. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator on Iwo Jima was measured in minutes. On March 26th, the island was finally declared secure. General Kuribayashi led his last remaining men in a final suicidal guerrilla attack before dying. His remains were never found. The butcher's bill was beyond comprehension. 6,821 Marines were killed. 19,217 were wounded. Over 26,000 American casualties for an 8-square-mile rock. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for Iwo Jima. But the bloodiest battle of all was yet to come. Iwo Jima had been secured. Damaged B-29s now had their emergency landing strip. But one island remained. The last step. The final fortress before the Japanese homeland itself. It was an island called Okinawa, 350 miles from mainland Japan. This would be the largest amphibious assault of the entire Pacific War. Over 1,400 ships, 18 aircraft carriers, 183,000 American troops, a combined force of Marines and Army divisions. The operation was codenamed Iceberg. It would last for 82 days. It would earn another name, the Typhoon of Steel. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, the landings began. 60,000 troops hit the beaches, bracing themselves for the hell of Tarawa, the meat grinder of Iwo Jima. They expected to be slaughtered on the sand. Instead, they found nothing. The beaches were empty. They were completely undefended. It was baffling. It was terrifying. The Americans advanced inland for miles, capturing 2 airfields, all without serious resistance. The Japanese had learned their lesson. Beach defenses were useless against American firepower. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Shijima, had conceded the landing. He had pulled his 110,000 troops south, into the rugged, cave-honeycombed highlands of the Shuri Line. His plan was not to win. His plan was to bleed. He would let the Americans land, let them advance, and then kill them in the hills. He would make the price for Okinawa so agonizingly high that America would abandon any thought of invading the home islands. The Americans had landed, but the Japanese struck first, not on land but at sea. Japan had committed its remaining air forces to one single, terrifying operation. Kikusui. Floating chrysanthemum. These were waves of mass suicide attacks, the kamikaze. The divine wind. Over 1,900 aircraft were gathered, most flown by pilots with less than 50 hours of flight training. They only needed to know how to take off and how to dive. On April 6th, the first mass attack came. Over 350 planes flew south, seeking the American fleet. American radar saw them coming, but the sheer number was overwhelming. Kamikazes dove through the walls of anti-aircraft fire. They were not trying to evade. They were aiming. They slammed into the destroyers on radar picket duty. The destroyer Bush was hit by 3 and like. The destroyer Kulhus took 4 hits and sank. For the American sailors, this was a new kind of psychological horror. You could not stop a man who was already dead. You could shoot his plane to pieces, but if he was still moving, he was still a threat. Gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. But still, they came. By the end of the campaign, kamikazes would sink 36 ships and damage 368 others. Nearly 5,000 American sailors would die. It was the highest naval loss of the war. But the fleet stayed. On land, the real battle began in mid-April. The Army and Marines pushed south and hit the Shuri Line. It was a nightmare. Every hill was a fortress. Every cave held Japanese soldiers. Then the rains came. For weeks it rained. The battlefield became a sea of mud. Vehicles vanished. Foxholes filled with water. Men lived, fought, and died in a knee-deep swamp of mud and rotting remains. This was not just a battle against soldiers. Nearly 500,000 Okinawan civilians were trapped in the middle. And the tragedy of Saipan repeated itself on a vastly larger scale. Over 120,000 civilians died. Some were killed in the crossfire, but thousands were killed by their own soldiers, who viewed them as spies or burdens. And thousands killed themselves, convinced by propaganda that the Americans were monsters. American troops found caves full of dead families, killed by their own military. Children were used as suicide bombers. On June 22nd, General Ushijima committed ritual suicide. The battle was over. The cost was beyond comprehension. 12,520 Americans killed. Over 110,000 Japanese soldiers dead. Over 120,000 civilians dead. American planners looked at these numbers. They looked at the fanaticism. And they drew the obvious, terrifying conclusion. The lesson of Okinawa was clear. Japan would not surrender. They would fight until every man, woman, and child was dead. The lesson of Okinawa was clear. Japan would not surrender. The military, the government, the civilians, they would fight until every man, woman, and child was dead. The invasion of the home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, was scheduled for November. American casualty projections were not just high. They were apocalyptic. 500,000, 1 million, maybe more. And Japanese casualties, military and civilian, would be in the tens of millions. President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's sudden death in April, studied these projections. He faced the hardest decision any president had ever confronted. Was there another way? Could the war be ended? Not by invading, but by simply stopping it? He had a secret that Secretary of War Henry Stimson had only briefed him on after he became president. For 3 years, America had been developing a new kind of military materiel, a weapon of unimaginable power, the Manhattan Project. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, they tested it. The Trinity test, the world's first atomic detonation. It erupted in a light, brighter than 1,000 suns. A mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet. The heat was so intense, it melted the desert sand into glass. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director, watched and recalled a line from Hindu scripture. Now I am, become death, the destroyer of worlds. The weapon worked. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration. It demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. It promised that refusal would result in prompt and utter destruction. Japan's military leadership refused. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, the B-29 Enola Gay released a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. It was codenamed Little Boy. It fell for 43 seconds. At 1,840 feet above the city, it detonated. The explosion was equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. A fireball, with a surface temperature hotter than the surface of the sun, appeared instantly. Everyone within a mile of ground zero was vaporized. Their shadows were permanently etched onto the walls and pavement behind them. The blast wave followed, flattening the city. A firestorm erupted, merging into a single, massive conflagration. 70,000 people died instantly. By the end of the year, the death toll would reach 140,000. From radiation, sickness, and injuries, Truman announced the attack, calling on Japan to surrender or face a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council was deadlocked. The military faction still refused to surrender. They argued Japan could endure. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading Manchuria. Japan was now beset on all sides. On August 9th, a second bomb was dropped. Fatman. The target was Nagasaki. 40,000 people died instantly. For 5 days, Japan's leaders debated. The military still argued for a final suicidal battle on the home islands. But Emperor Hirohito finally intervened. In an unprecedented move, he spoke. The war must end. On August 15, 1945, for the first time in history, the people of Japan heard their emperor's voice. In a formal recorded message, he announced the surrender. On September 2, 1945, on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender documents were signed. 3 years, 8 months, and 25 days after Pearl Harbor, the war was over. The cost was almost incomprehensible. Over 111,000 American military deaths in the Pacific. Over 2 million Japanese military deaths. And the civilians. An estimated 20 million Chinese. Over 120,000 Okinawans. Over 200,000 at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Millions more across Southeast Asia. The questions remain. Could the war have been avoided? Could it have ended sooner? Were the atomic bombs necessary? Or was there another way? History offers no simple answers, only reflections. The Pacific War changed the world. It ended empires. It created new superpowers. It forged alliances from the ashes of its hatred. And it showed humanity a new, terrible power. A power that could end all war by ending the world itself. From the sleeping battleships at Pearl Harbor to the burning cities of Japan, it was a crucible that forged the modern age. It was paid for in blood, in sacrifice, and in a suffering that is almost too vast to comprehend. We have reached the end of our story tonight. We talk about these events, not to glorify them, but to remember, to understand the price that was paid, and to reflect on the profound, enduring questions they leave behind. Thank you for listening. I hope these stories, in their own somber way, give you a moment of perspective. I hope you can now find some rest. Good night.